Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I have been asked by at least one person to address the recent video where Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor, infamously said that there is no such thing as canon in Tolkien. And my initial response to that was, I'm not going to cover that because it's clearly an edited interview, and therefore it's not really even clear exactly what he's talking about and what he means by that. And it reminded me of the video that came out a couple of years ago where he got really criticized. And he came out later and said, yeah, that interview was heavily edited, and it's not at all what I was trying to say there. And there were people, of course, who were still like, well, it's still bad. And I'm like, oh, whatever. I mean, you can't make everybody happy. Sure enough, Corey Olsen has come out and actually done his own response video on this topic. And I'm going to link to both the original interview, which is on Twitter, and then his follow-up video, which is on YouTube, in the description below, so you can check those out yourself. But I wanted to talk about this not so much as an exercise in criticizing Corey Olsen for what he said, but in terms of looking at what really is canon in Tolkien. What do we mean when we say that Rings of Power is not canon, and going against canon, and just kind of generally talk about these topics. Now, first of all, I wanted to try to play the video in this for this one, but it just really messes up with my RAM. So I apologize. I'm not going to be able to actually play the interview and react to it kind of in real time here. So I'm just going to have to describe it for those who haven't actually seen it. Basically, the clip, which is less than 2 minutes total, and isn't just Corey Olsen talking, it's also got another guy. He starts out with a statement of, basically, the first thing we have to clear up is that there's really no such thing as canon in Tolkien. Right off the bat, your alarm bells should be going off. Because when the thing that is the first words out of somebody's mouth is, the first thing we have to clear up, there is clearly prior context. And we don't have that in this video. We just don't. So we don't know what he's responding to exactly. And it's also not clear how much of the remainder of the interview is edited. We know some of it probably is, because I'm pretty sure there's at least 1 or 2 cuts that you can actually see in the video. And there may be more, because a lot of it has Rings of Power footage overlaid, and you can't actually see anybody talking. Either, Varking is the guy's kind of like handle, or Corey Olsen. So you don't know how much of the stuff in there is actually cut. And this is a thing, like, this is part of me being a lawyer, right? I mean, like, I already know from how things work in the legal field that context is really key. And if you're, for example, filing a motion and you're going to, attach a deposition so that you have, testimony to back up what your motion is trying to argue for, you have basically put yourself in a position where you better make sure that what it's saying in context is what you're saying, because if you put it in and then somebody else comes along and says, oh, but here's like the 3 pages around that, and it clearly shows that it doesn't mean what this guy's saying, well, you basically just set yourself up to lose, because now you look dishonest. But this is just broadly applicable for anything. You always want to know the context. And so anytime I see any kind of footage, clip, interview, whatever it is, where clearly context is missing, I really want to stress that we should always be very, very hesitant to jump to conclusions about anything in that footage, video, whatever it is. Just, take a few seconds and think about, okay, is there any conceivable way in which I can imagine this got started where this would make sense, right? So there's that consideration right off the bat. But of course, the famously, controversial statement that he makes is there's no such thing as canon in Tolkien. What does he mean by that? Well, in his follow-up video, he actually explains what he means by that, and he says canon in, his field, which is English Lit, and what he means by it in this context is there is no, like, authoritatively defined set of these are the works and nothing else. Because there really is no way to authoritatively define that. There's no there's no set of works that we can say are definitively in or out, other than perhaps to say, the published works. But as he points out in his own follow-up video, that would basically mean you can't really count the Silmarillion, because that wasn't published by Tolkien. That was published by Christopher several years after J.R.R. Tolkien's death. So you couldn't even count the Silmarillion, and who's going to count out the Silmarillion? So in that sense of the word, canon really doesn't exist with Tolkien. The only person who could authoritatively determine what counts for Tolkien's own purposes would be Tolkien himself, or maybe potentially Christopher as somebody to whom that authority was transferred, essentially. But this hasn't been done, and we know, as Corey Olsen points out, that Tolkien was constantly reworking ideas and thinking about things. Now, there's a couple of points in the interview that people seem to have kind of latched onto, one of which is the idea that, Gandalf arrived in the Second Age, and as Corey Olsen points out, he actually was toying with that idea, but he was also, Tolkien was also toying with the idea of the elves having met, Olorin and Curunir and all these other characters who would later become the wizards, even as far back as the First Age. Now, there's so many different ways you could look at this, because, if you want to look at it from the perspective of this contradicts the canon, if we want to call the canon, the actual written material in The Lord of the Rings, then the only way it contradicts it is if we assume that Gandalf, who we now know that's who the stranger is. I haven't watched Season 2. I'm not going to watch Season 2, but you can't avoid it on Twitter when you follow Tolkien-related stuff. We know now that it's Gandalf, right? Now, the only way this contradicts what's in the Lord of the Rings appendices, which says they arrived at 1000 in the Third Age, is if Gandalf stays in Middle-earth the entire time and never leaves, so that he can then come back and arrive on a ship. We don't know that that's going to happen. For all we know, at the end of this show, Gandalf is going to hightail it back to Valinor, and then it's going to happen again, right? I mean, we don't know. So what Corey Olsen is pointing out is perfectly true. It's this doesn't contradict anything. It's perfectly plausible that he could have been here in the Second Age, gone back, and then come back by ship, and what's in, The Lord of the Rings is still true. It is also the fact that, and I don't remember exactly what the specific detail was, but there was a point where in the editing for the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, I think, maybe it was later or something, but it's been a long time since I read it, so I forget the details. There was a entry in there that had to do with, it might have been Arwen's age or something, but Tolkien basically said it's a scribal error. It actually should have been a different year or something. Again, I don't remember the exact details of what it was or any of that, but I know this was a thing. And so even where you would most tend to think that there's no real room for change, Tolkien is like, oh, yeah, I need to change that, and I'm going to find a way to do it. Tolkien does this all the time. He changed the 5th chapter of The Hobbit rather radically. He changes lots of things. He tries to find in-universe explanations for them, and that's kind of easy to do whenever you make the whole thing like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the Red Book. You can always come up with some explanation like scribal error, right? You can always do that. But the point is, Tolkien, to the extent that he considered anything kind of set in stone, it would have been the stuff that was published, but that still didn't stop him from making changes. So even the arrived in 1000 in the Third Age is potentially up for grabs as a scribal error. Maybe it was, 1000 of the Second Age and it got, put in the wrong spot. You can imagine different scenarios, right? Now, I agree with the complaints to the extent that the Rings of Power is definitely doing things which contradict what is written by Tolkien and contradict not just a version, but any version Tolkien ever wrote. One of the things that a lot of the debate tends to go around is Galadriel and her history. It's like, well, Tolkien wrote a whole bunch of different versions and they all contradict each other. It's like, well, yeah, but none of them had Galadriel doing this or being here or whatever, right? There is no version in the story of Galadriel and Celeborn where Celeborn is missing in action for thousands of years. It just doesn't happen. yes, it is true that the writers of this show are writing stories that just do not match up at all with anything Tolkien ever wrote. And I think that's a valid criticism. But saying that it violates the canon is not, strictly speaking, the right way to talk about that. The best way to say it is there is no version of what Tolkien wrote that this doesn't contradict. And that's, it's a little wordier, but it is more precise. Because canon is not really the right way to describe it. I understand, I do it the same way too, because canon is just a nice little shorthand word to mean what we want it to mean, but it is imprecise. It's not really what it means. So I do agree with a lot of the complaints, but I also recognize that what Corey Olsen is saying is a more technical use of the term, and he's saying something which is true. Now, there are a lot of other things we could say about this, and one of the things that I do want to point out is, how should we think about the idea of Tolkien and canon? To the extent that we mean canon as these are kind of the settled ideas that aren't going to change. Well, it's a problem because, as he points out, Corey Olsen, they are always changing. Tolkien's ideas are constantly changing. Who Gil-galad's parents are is a thing that changes a lot, and it changes because of the identity of the people and because of the names of the people. Both their identity and their names change over the course of him writing the Silmarillion type material. And so it's kind of always up in the air as to who it was supposed to be. And Christopher's theory on this, and people have done videos on it, is that he kind of made a mistake when he wrote what he did in The Lord of the Rings about this. And therefore it probably shouldn't have been what it was. And it's partially because the names were in flux. And he wrote the Lord of the Rings over so many years that it changed in between. So there's things like that, too, that, just errors make it in. Another thing that people have kind of latched onto is this, and this is partially, again, the way the stupid video is edited. Immediately after Corey Olsen gets through saying there's no such thing as canon in Tolkien, we get this video clip from the Rings of Power of this Harfoot, I guess, talking to the stranger saying, "Thank you kindly, Grand Elf." And this is supposed to be apparently how Gandalf gets his name in this universe, which is the most... I have a feeling Tolkien, if he actually saw that, would maybe vomit a little in his own mouth, because he would just revolt at the linguistic nonsense at play there. But at any rate, the point being, it seems, because of the way it's edited, as if Corey Olsen is endorsing this version of how Gandalf gets his name, which is not exactly what's going on. I don't think that's what he's saying at all. It's just the way that somebody edited the video. But it is worth noting, and this is really interesting, that even in a topic of like what Gandalf's name is and how he got his name, it's not even clear what Tolkien's thoughts were. And interestingly enough, just very recently, within the last week since, I think, as of me recording this, Stephen Gibb, formerly known as the Red Book, did a video on Gandalf's names, and in particular, he talks a lot about the Incarnus name, which is about him being, from the South, or the name that he has in the South. And he points out that there are two late writings by Tolkien which contradict each other on this point. One of them, and I think this is the earlier, is that Incarnus is a name that he gets in the region of Harad, which is the word for south. I mean, it's literally Elvish for south. And that's just the name that he has among them, and it means North Spy, and then, he just has that name down there. Then there's another writing, which I think is the later of the two, if I remember right, where Incarnus is actually, I think it's Quenya, and means something about like gray-bearded or something to that effect, and it's actually a word that is given as a name in Gondor, because relative to where Gandalf does most of his stuff, which is in the northern part of Middle-earth, up, in Eriador and, Rovanian and all this, relative to that, Gondor is the South. So Tolkien had conflicting ideas on a topic which is in the book already, and neither of them can be ruled out by the book either, because the book, as written and published, doesn't actually say what he means by the South. It doesn't clarify that for us. Now, he's talking to Gondorians when he says this. So my preferred explanation is the former, where it's actually he went to Harad. But that does have its own problems. I mean, both of them have their own problems. So I use this as an example because it shows, even on a topic which is actually kind of brought up by this video, Tolkien himself was changing his ideas of how Gandalf got names, where he got them, and writes contradictory things on that point. So we can't just definitively say, this is set in stone and we know exactly what it means and there's no arguing about it. Well, no, Tolkien could, do a lot of things with that and just end up changing everything, that you think you know. So it's just an example of Corey Olsen's point being true, which is the ideas that Tolkien has about his own work are constantly being updated, changed, modified, whatever you want to say. And therefore, it's really dangerous to try to pin anything down. It's just impossible at the end of the day to say that this can never be changed, because the things that you would think would be the most beyond changing are things that Tolkien did change or suggest should be changed. So, what is canon in Tolkien, if we want to use it in that loose sense? I don't think you can say anything is just absolutely canon. The only thing that we can say is that certain ideas seem to have been solidified over time, and you can, pin that down fairly well if you read through all the histories. You can get a pretty good idea of, the character of Thingol doesn't change in terms of his identity. There's a lot of the stuff like that you can say that this is probably not ever going to change because it never has. But there's a lot of stuff where he's constantly working on it, and it's like, where did he end up? It's not 100% clear, because he could have changed his mind again and just not written anything down. Is there anything that's beyond change? Probably not. But there are things that are, fairly well established, and therefore probably not going to change unless he comes up with a reason why it needs to be the case. And in fact, if I remember correct, the reason why he wanted to change a date in the Tale of Years regarding Arwen's age is because he started working on, how do elves mature? And this is all in Nature of Middle-earth, right? I don't remember for sure if this is exactly the thing, but this is what my memory is telling me, which may be faulty. Somebody can check me, prove me wrong, but I want to say this is what it was there was, he started looking at when do elves actually kind of come of age, marriageable age, basically. And he realized, this doesn't actually work with the date that I gave for Arwen's birth. So I need to change that. But this is my point. The idea that you would think these things are kind of set in stone once he puts them in writing because he tended to think of them that way, that's even not 100% true. So it's not fair to say that anything is 100% set in stone. It is also not fair to say that Corey Olsen is saying something just radical when he says there's no such thing as canon. Do I think Corey Olsen is more sanguine about the whole Rings of Power thing than I would be? Absolutely. I think part of that is just he is a very positive outlook type of guy than I am. I think he's just happy with... He's just an optimistic type of person, is what I'm trying to say. He's just very, very hyper-positive in a way that I am not. He likes everything in a way that I don't. And I don't mean that in a disparaging sense, that he just likes trash. I mean, he just he finds enjoyment in practically everything. I'm a lot pickier. But the point being, what he says is not incorrect, and it's not something that is really something that you could criticize if you understand what he means by that, and you understand how Tolkien's work progresses over time. It's just true that Tolkien was changing constantly, and you can't get around it. And that's famously one of the reasons why Christopher had such a hard time getting the Silmarillion finally published. He had so much material to work with so many differences, and it was hard for him to determine what was the best, most up-to-date, most consistent work. And this is why Christopher himself would later say, I messed up here because I really should have considered this, and I think based on new evidence, this was actually the better thing to have put in the, the published Silmarillion. Christopher himself was open to saying, oops, I goofed. And who would know better than him what his father would have wanted, right? If he can't get it right, we sure aren't going to get it right. So maybe we should all take a little bit of humble pie and, not jump on people because they say things that were like, I don't like that. Just chill. Take a chill pill. But those are kind of my main points for this video. I'm not covering it because I want to criticize Corey Olsen. There are things, like I said, where I disagree with him. But my main points are always be careful, especially with edited footage, of criticizing what people say. If you don't know the full context especially, you're going to say something that's maybe a little over the line. And as far as what actually counts as canon, it's tricky. It really is. And we shouldn't be, absolutely hard-nosed about it. Now, that's not to say that you cannot criticize Rings of Power. I do, and that's why I didn't watch Season 2 and why I won't watch any more of it, because as far as I'm concerned, they're not adapting Tolkien at this point. There is certainly enough evidence there that they are literally just making stuff up without any regard to what Tolkien wrote, and in fact often contradicting any possible version of what Tolkien wrote on certain points, that it's no longer an adaptation. It's just we're going to use the setting, but make up our own story entirely. Okay, fine, but you're effectively doing fan fiction at that point, and I'm just not interested. I'm just not interested. Especially when the show itself was not even well written to begin with. So, I'm perfectly happy, criticizing the Rings of Power because it is bad, and it does contradict what Tolkien wrote in a lot of ways, and in ways that we have no reason to think that Tolkien would have changed his mind to fit with what they've done. So that criticism is fine, but again, be careful with the use of the word canon. And just because you use it in a way that is imprecise doesn't mean that somebody else who says there's no such thing as canon, that doesn't mean they're using it in the same way that you are. So be careful of criticizing others, be careful of how you use the word canon, and be careful of how you even think about how set in stone Tolkien's writings actually are. If you're not going to actually kind of sit down and do the work of how set in stone is this really likely to be, you have less business criticizing people who say it's not set in stone. But even, if you do a lot of the reading and really understand how fluctuating his ideas are, you still ought to be at least a little bit humble and recognize, somebody else's ideas you may not agree with. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're absolutely absurdly wrong. So that's the main reason I wanted to make this video, is to basically be a cautionary note of how we should think about this in the future and how we should not just browbeat others and call them basically traitors because they disagree with us. That's just not, it's not healthy and it's not fair. So if you found any value in this rant, please do like and share the video around. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch more of my future content. If you're on YouTube, of course, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien trivia questions every week. And check out the other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, Stephen Clayton, and Spud.